That was a couple of weeks and I started this on this never conceived. The right is really capable. On the left side of the world is all white. Because it was the it's just when it's so perfect. I heard things like that. You know, it's cool. It's nice. Well, that's what we does.
Thank you all for joining us today at the Richmond Arts Center. It is a great pleasure and honor to be able to have the exhibition Joan Brown in Living Color. We look at these works and they are fresh, vibrant, more than a half century after Joan Brown's journey began, and the vitality and humor and generosity of the artist fills the gallery. Today we have gathered with a special group who knew Joan Brown, who can speak to her as a teacher and as a cohort. It is a special joy to invite you to join me in welcoming our guests as they help us in picturing a life. Bob Brokaw studied with Joan Brown. He has worked and exhibited throughout these years. He was a very good student. Unlike myself, he has notes. He has notes, and he has so much to share with us. It's an extraordinary privilege to have John Seed with us today. John, who also studied with Joan Brown, has written extensively of the art of that period of artists Richard Diebenkorn, Elmer Bischoff, David Park, and John has come up from Southern California, and we're so happy to have him with this really generous spirit to share his experiences with us and his thoughts. And we have Phil Linares with us today, whom many of you know from his years at the Oakland Museum as the chief curator. And Phil has graciously loaned his own Joan Brown to the exhibition. He has had a working relationship which spanned many years. He was the director of the gallery at the San Francisco Art Institute when Joan Brown received the Adeline Kent Award, and he mounted that exhibition for her. And then he also mounted a large exhibition at Mills College when he was the director and curator of the Mills College Gallery. So I'm very thrilled to have everyone here. This is, in fact, I hope, a really going to be very informal. We have lots of wonderful artists here and others who knew Joan Brown as well. So I'm looking forward to a lot of revelations. First, I'd love to hear just about I'm gonna sit down, just about your very first encounter with Joan. The first day you walked into class or the first day you met her. And I'm gonna pass the mic to you, John, first. If you could just talk a little bit about that very first impression, encounter, exchange.
Well, it was memorable to say the least. And how's my mic? Is it coming through? Can you hear me in the back? Are we good? Yeah, okay. Well, it didn't go well. And to give a little bit of the backstory, I had graduated from Stanford in painting. One of, just a handful of painting students, because most people didn't go to Stanford to paint then and didn't go to Stanford to paint now. And, but I'd had this wonderful experience of having a mentor in Nate Oliveira. So I think that the backstory is that I came to Berkeley for two reasons, and the reasons were Elmer Bischoff and Joan Brown. But came from this background of having been, one of just a few painters in the department and receiving a lot of attention and being, very intent on what I was doing. And I also think that the work I had in my portfolio that got me admitted to Berkeley, some of it was really directed to Joan Brown. I'd seen her work at Hampson Fuller before it was Fuller Goldine, and some of the the personal and the diary aspects. I'd showed work that was similar. So I wasn't in Joan's class, but I had to make an appointment to see her. And I made an appointment, and I brought a very, very large painting, a 7 by 9 foot painting, because I wanted to make a big first impression. And it was so big, it was rolled up in my truck. I had to stretch it downstairs in the White Gallery, and this took a couple of hours. And finally, in the afternoon, she had a class. She came down, and I think she was tired. It's a little bit of a setup for this. But the painting was a very big painting called Dead Duck, and it was sarcastic. It was a big, brushy, sarcastic, kind of all over the place painting. And she pretty immediately just laid into it. And some of the things I remember, because I was stunned, nobody had ever spoken to me this way my whole life. It was a lazy painting. It was a painting that showed I really didn't know what I was trying to do. It didn't have a clear story. And then what really got to me, she actually said, no one's ever going to respect you or your work if you keep going this way. So I kind of pulled back a little bit and think of a younger version of the guy you see now, but, a little less wise. And I said, well, Joan, I said, that's a lot to think about, but isn't there anything you liked about the painting? She looked at me, she said, you need your ass kicked. And she left the room. And that was my first visit with Joan Brown. Bob, you're on.
I can't top that. Shoot. Joan can be harsh, but I don't think she ever said that to me. I think my first encounter was probably, I think I managed to get into one of her classes as an undergraduate. And she just was incredibly, you look at the books, very distinctive looking. She was very short. She was kind of intense. Her hair was always, she was always very well put together, very attractive. Fingers covered with rings. Her hair was always handed. She always wore slacks. She had a pair of cowboy boots she really favored. So she'd clomp down the hall in cowboy boots. The janitors at night, because I painted at night, would complain that she would clomp down the hall in her cowboy boots with a cup of coffee and slurp coffee on the floor. That they had. The janitors had all the good information, Hasselschmidt and the liquor bottles. But she was always, pretty courteous to me. She was, she didn't like something you were doing. She'd find some way to kind of say like, well, do you know those people, or what does that mean to you, or something. But I found her, unlike a lot of the male faculty, just very encouraging. I think she was definitely cut from the cloth of teachers that thought it was important to be nurturing. But she could be harsh.
My first encounter with Joan is as follows. I was enrolled as a sophomore at the California College of Arts and Crafts in 1959. And the Art Institute was a forbidding place. We were all intimidated by the Art Institute. This was also a time, shortly within 2 years after Paul Mills' legendary exhibition that introduced the Bay Area figurative artists, Richard Diebenkorn, Elmer Bischoff, and so on. And we had all heard about Joan Brown and Manuel Neri and these great artists. In fact, Manuel, who never got a sheepskin anywhere, had studied at CCAC for a while, and I think he was kicked out because he was using too much plaster. In any case, 22 of us had rented 3 mansions on Lake Merritt for $225 total. Our rent was $10 a month. And we were right next, it's where that big white building, 1300 Lakeshore, is now. They were going to be torn down, so we got cheap rent. Anyhow, I was working late, and I came home, and I saw all these cars parked along the street. I thought, oh, the Christian Science Church must be having some kind of event. No, it was a rent party at my house that I had sort of forgotten about. Actually, it was in the middle house. I had, Bob Bechtel and I had the Victorian on the right. A bunch of people had the Prairie House in the middle, and more people had the Tudor on the left. The party was in the middle house. So I went in. The fee, the rent part was 50 cents. People had to pay 50 cents to come to the party. And I went into the kitchen, and it was real hot because they were trying to make hot mulled wine on the stove, not on the top of the stove, but in a huge crock on the oven door, which was propped up with bricks, and the oven was on full blast. Standing on the kitchen table was my teacher, Clayton Pinkerton, who was painting the spaghetti sauce on the wall. And leaning against the wall, kind of blurry-eyed, was Joan Brown. This was like 1960 maybe, and that's my first encounter with Joan Brown.
We have been joined by a local treasure. Hilda Robinson is here with us, and she also has stories and studied with Joan at UC Berkeley.
Hi.
Could you tell us a little bit? Well, it's on. Just hold it close. Just hold it close. Your first impression of Joan, when you first met her, your first class with her, or the first meeting you had with her, first encounter?
It seems so long ago, I can't remember a first impression. I had people like Volkos. I wanted to be a sculptor, so I took Volkos, and I had Miyazaki for printing, and I had Sylvia Lark, and even Jay DeFeo. So there were so many colorful characters at Cal. But Joan was the one who really helped me through. And Elmer Bischoff, of course, because he adored her and she adored him. But she was a powerful teacher. Small built, and I was a late in life. I went in after a couple years at Temple University, Philadelphia. That's where I started my career. So I was older than she was, I'm sure. But she was just stunning. She wore Gloria Vanderbilt jeans, and she had 24 karat gold Nefertiti earrings and gold around her neck, and this beautiful red hair, and then cerulean blue eyes. That's my favorite color, and she had these eyes. But she was all business. She was a teacher. She came into the room, she was never late. The class was always crowded. We had butcher paper on the rolls, the whole roll like you get from the meat market. And that stood in the corner. You had either the brown butcher paper or you had the white butcher paper. And what we did was pull that paper out as long as you wanted, because we worked on flat tables and we stood up, we couldn't sit. So you pull out the paper and then put it on the table, and you drew from the model with oil pastels. That was a medium we used. And I still use that medium. She was tough. She didn't say a lot to me, but she encouraged me. And she was my mentor through my master's. And just really, I think I learned more from looking at her work than from her instruction, because she just kind of quietly walked around and kind of nudged you forward. So I think she is really instrumental on who I am now, very much so.
Thank you. We encounter so many different voices when we develop as young artists. And I was wondering, how different was Joan for you than some of the other instructors you had? How different was the feel and the approach, and how she approached your work and your own intentions, and how did she guide you relative to, say, Nathan Oliveira or Elmer Bischoff or some of the other of these great artists? Joan, do you want to?
I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think I could contrast her to Volkos, for instance, who was never there. He only came for the critique, and he always, and you might know these stories, he always created work in front of us. And Vaya, who was his henchman, you know, he made his clay for him, and he would throw these enormous figures or pots and throw porcelain in it. And so they expected us to know everything when we got there. And they were just kind of divas who walked around. So that's why, I don't remember them saying a great deal, but I just know that they knew what they knew. And I just kind of got the aura. But I really think that I went in as a junior, and they just expected me to know. So I just learned by critique. The critiques were always very strict and very pointed. So I think that if you didn't have anything to say, you would know it just by being ignored, maybe. But
You know, thinking about that, well, I'll contrast her to Elmer Bischoff. Elmer Bischoff was one of those artists, he was very, very gentle, and we all knew his reputation just as we knew Joan's reputation. And I think that the way I eventually got good criticism from Elmer was I'd have to put a drawing in front of him and say, I want you to respond to this drawing. And I'd get good criticism. Whereas with Joan, I agree with what you said. When I did take her class, because after the first incident, I pulled back and I thought, well, I need to take her class. And it went well. I mean, the second time taking her class, it was a great experience. And, but anyways, her critiques were rigorous and clear, and so were her assignments. And I think I put up, or I emailed to Jan, one assignment I remember was self-portrait as an animal, which is a very Joan Brown assignment. And to kind of address the fact that she thought I was, you know, lazy as a student or maybe wasn't living up to my potential, mine was called Long Shot. And it showed a horse that was behind all the others in the race and the jockey had fallen off. And she really liked it. Because to really answer your question specifically, the way she was different from others is she insisted on the personal. You know, I'd come out of admiring, you know, David Park and Nate Oliveira and Elmer Bischoff, kind of universal humanism or maybe intimism. And Joan was about, you put yourself out there. So she was my first Frida Kahlo, would be a way to put it.
I guess to tag along with what John said is that it wasn't even so much what she said as what, if you knew her work and kind of knew her, her work was so personal. I mean, she talked about her family, her son, her dogs. I love dogs, have dogs. It was about her life. It was narrative. It was diary. And as a young gay man in the youngish in the late 70s, it was, I think, really important, for her to basically give you permission to talk about your life. So I did my friends and outings to Russian River and the dogs, and I think that what she elevated, what she made important for people, and I think one reason why women, especially, I think really, and probably gay men, etc., responded to her work was simply that she described her life. It was interesting because Sura Wood wrote a preview of the show, and she mentioned that Joan wasn't political, quote unquote, wasn't political, and I don't really disagree with that. I think that the fact that she highlighted people's lives, she treated, these things that were traditionally kind of perhaps marginalized or not considered significant important. Domestic interiors, her own response to great masters, but very personal in inserting herself in dogs. There's that great painting out that moment now, she and Noel and Bob the dog and the Alhambra. So I think her personal, she basically, I remember I came up with some of the things that Joan advised. She dropped little bon mots, like, don't forget that black is a color, and always a little bit of pattern is a good thing. Black and white, put a little black and white in. And I remember once telling her something, well, I can't do that. And she just kind of reared herself up and said, well, of course you can. Why wouldn't you? So it was this sort of nudging, promotion. She told little stories. I remember being in class and she dropped, I'm going to be in the Bad Painting Show in New York. And this, now legendary show. And we all kind of giggled. All these dinners. And I think she was sort of taken aback by that. And she's, well, by that I think Marcia Tucker means, non-academic. So she would, these little asides and the art world and the kind of the bitterness and the resentment of the art world that imagine, Elmer Bischoff had this like catty old chair in his studio and these people would come through and say, oh, Elmer's got this like luxury chair. So she would, and just her example, she was her narrative. I think Joan Brown had a narrative. Everyone kind of knew this story, swimming in the bay, and even though she was, they were throwing money at her for her thick paintings, she stopped. you know? So that was also, I think, the example that she provided, is that you can go your own way even if people think you're nuts.
Your mention of political brings to mind one time when Joan and Gordon Cook and others were teaching at the Academy of Art, which at the time was considered kind of a massage parlor. And the
And now?
conditions... the conditions were not good for teachers or students, and so Joan and all the other teachers picketed on the street, and so I think that was a political point. I got to know Joan better after 1967, when I was appointed director of exhibitions at the Art Institute, and one of the first exhibitions was a group drawing show, and she submitted a large pencil drawing of a buffalo in Golden Gate Park, which was a very nice work. It was a big group show. It included work by Gordon Cook and a whole bunch of Bay Area artists, including Bruce Nauman, who I guess at the time was a student at Davis. And Bruce's drawings were just little 8.5 by 11 drawings on like typing paper, and they were working drawings for that famous hologram that he did, where he's putting his hands in his mouth and so on. And I asked him for a return address, and he says, "Oh, forget it. You can have them when they come back." Well, the show never came back. It was stolen at some Podunk art college or college in Alabama or Arkansas, and turned in. Well, Peter Saul had a nice piece in that show too, but the entire exhibition was stolen, I guess, from the loading dock of this little Podunk school, and it turned into a big insurance snaggle. I'm still looking at auctions to see where these works went. In any case, I also worked with Joan on the Adeline Kent Award exhibition. The Adeline Kent Award was given in honor of Adeline Kent, the sculptor who died in 1957 in Sausalito in an automobile accident. And her husband, Robert Boardman Howard, gave an endowment for the exhibition. And it was the winner of the Adeline Kent Award was determined by the Artists Committee, which was a committee of 30 Bay Area artists who would get together. They'd form a committee, and they would give the award to a young, up-and-coming, promising artist. And people like Jay DeFeo and Manuel Neri and others received this award. And it consisted of a cash award of a couple $1,000s and a solo exhibition. And for Joan, it was the Dancers series that she had completed in '72, and I think the show was in '73. And it was all these pictures of dancers. I've got a couple pictures here.
It's up at MoMA now. They have it, it's hanging.
Also, there was this painting. This is a large painting, and it was a diptych. It's now owned by the DeRosa Foundation. And the painting on the left was about 2 inches longer than the painting on the right. And we got kind of a laugh over that. But when Rene DeRosa bought the painting, he had it kind of squared up, so now it's all the same. But those were the kind of little eccentricities that we really enjoyed. Well, later.
More to say.
I was wondering if there was something that really you feel altered your course. If there was something that someone she had you look at, something that she pointed to in your work, in terms of materials or direction or quality in your work, something that actually redirected you and influenced you.
I think so, yes, of course. She just made me feel that I could use any color anywhere and draw anything. And that was, it was a freedom to be who I am. And I maybe even didn't see this until recently when I came to the exhibition here. And I saw some of the things that she did. I said, oh my goodness, she was influencing me without saying it. But yes, she's very important to whom I am right now. maybe you can see that in my work.
Yes.
But especially the use of the medium and the color and the freedom to do whatever I wanted to do.
I just want to interject here to invite all of you to come back. I mean, come often, come soon, but also come back in June when we're going to have more of Hilda's work right here in the gallery spotlighted, because it's really fabulous and lyrical, and they share so much, share music too, and music and dance and pattern and rhythm too.
And that was Joan. I can't remember what exhibit I went to of her work. I didn't make a habit of going to exhibits, but I went to one and the whole room would be one painting, you know, and there were something about going into the future and the past, and there were Egyptian things and, you know, and the colors that she created were her colors. I don't think anybody else could mix purple like she did, and all of that. She just taught a new way of doing things for me. So.
I think of her as a clarifier. And I want to share an anecdote from someone else. I was trading email with Eve Ashheim, and Eve is a painter who, she teaches at Princeton, and she's married to John Yao, who's a very good critic. And she studied quite a bit with Joan Brown. And she said that when she met Joan, she was doing both abstract and representational paintings, and Joan had a talk with her. And she said, you have to choose. And she made her choose. And with me, something similar. Her big feedback to me was that I was lacking clarity, that I really hadn't thought hard enough about what I was doing. And I did some very reduced, very simple paintings that, looking back, looked a little bit like her enamel paintings. I saw one of her enamel self-portraits. So she got me to clarify.
That's really interesting, since she had to make a decision at a very important point in time historically, where essentially the Art Institute forced that. You had to be in one camp or the other. You could, you know, follow in Still's camp and be your abstract expressionist painter, or you could follow in the Park and Bischoff direction. And those kinds of decisions came down, and you couldn't be with one foot in each camp, because they were diametrically, almost religiously opposed, weren't they? It's just really,
It was,
yeah.
the camps were pretty divided, the figs and the abexes. But I think that she got around that by what I remember is simply her encouraging independence. The story of Park and Bischoff, both her teachers, fighting over whether she should do thick paint or not, and they disagreed, and so she decided she was going to do whatever she wanted. She repeated the Elmer advice that he told her about following your own nose. The advice she gave a very bitter artist about the only person whose bitterness is going to stop painting is yourself. And I think her life story, Phil is leafing through this book, I was looking at it last night, cribbing, reliving her early life. I mean, she grew up in people already know the story probably, a 3-bedroom rental apartment in the marina. Her grandmother, who'd never recovered from her husband being killed on a train trying to get back to San Francisco after the earthquake. Her mother developed adult onset epilepsy. Her father worked in the bank, and they had such an awful marriage that he drank every night. But she took his side because she said she would have too. So it was this dark apartment. As soon as she could, she fled. And I think that basically it was like a kid in a candy shop art, that it was this whole discovery. And her early paintings remind me of it's that kind of, it maybe only happens when you're young or something, that you can do no wrong. It's like, look, ma, no hands. You can, you know, it's before you realize that you're walking on a tightrope and there's no net and it's quite a long way down. It's like kind of early Hockney or something. Her early paintings are travel paintings, and the paintings, the drawings in there's this incredible joy and exuberance. And I think even now you try to recapture that because you know too much at some point, right? You know all your failures, and you see people looking over your shoulder, and you wonder how much time you have, and et cetera. And I think that to try to get back to that point in Joan's life, especially in the beginning, the enthusiasm and the energy and the honest kind of response, I think, is really important. That's kind of what I remember about her.
I recall 3 other times I worked with Joan on exhibitions. Another one in the 70s, in the mid-70s, was in Benicia. Manuel Neri, by this time, was living in the church that he had purchased in Benicia. And he wanted to do something for the community. And he was going with a woman who was the PR lady for Chevron at the time. And so Chevron and Manuel decided that they would take over the old armory, the great big stone armory, and do an art show. And so Manuel asked me to curate the show. It was 100,000 square feet, and they had some volunteers build a big sheetrock wall down the middle. And in the meantime, I had a rented van, a big truck, and I was driving around picking up big paintings to fill this place. Paintings from Bill Wiley and Peter Saul, and things from Clayton Bailey, and of course Joan. And we installed the show, and it was a great show. It was, a big event. However, Manuel had broken up with the PR lady before the show was over. And so my honorarium was in the air, and Manuel was having a solo exhibition at the Oakland Museum. She said, well, go and pick out something that doesn't belong to somebody. So I did. I picked out a full plaster figure, which I still have. It's a glorious thing. At the Art Institute, a group of artists had put together a group called Dirt to Monsoon. To this day, I don't know what that means, but Dirt to Monsoon it was. And we all together rented an old warehouse, 80 Bluxom Street, an old warehouse in South of Market. It was real dark and dreary, and we all agreed to do something to do a show. And I said that I would install the show, and I'd even bring some white paint from the Art Institute walls to, paint the panels. The Samoan guys, students at the Art Institute, said they'd furnish the wallboard and the pig. The wallboard, when they arrived on the appointed day, here comes this big truck full of sort of dog-eared plywood panels that I later learned they had ripped off from one of these construction sites. They put up panels to keep people from falling in the hole. So we put all these panels up and we painted them white and so on. And I asked Joan if she'd be in the show, and she said sure. She'd come right in. She helped out and helped with the installation and all. And then the Samoans dug a big hole out in front, and they did a pig in this pit. And it attracted people from all over because the smell of it was quite astounding. The last show I did with Joan was at Mills College. In the 80s, I was director of the Mills College Art Gallery. And we did a show called Joan Brown from the Studio. This is a picture of Joan and Donald, her cat. And the deal here was that I rented another big truck, and we went over to Joan's studio, which was at this time in Diamond Heights. She lived in a modified Eichler. Modified because she had built a second story, which is kind of unusual for an Eichler. This Eichler also had an atrium. And Joan, of course, loving animals, fed raccoons in the atrium. The raccoons would come out of the trees, climb over the roof, and down into the atrium, and she would feed them dog food every night. So, anyhow, we completely cleared out the studio. We just took everything out of the studio and put it in the truck, drove it to Mills College, which has a 5,000 square foot gallery, and we laid everything out, and there might have been a few leftovers, but it was a beautiful show again. So,
I saw that.
you saw that show?
Yeah, it was a beautiful show.
I'd just like to actually interject the story about Joan that came from one of the artists who couldn't be with us today, but who's actually in this exhibition, and that is Paul Koss. So I was astonished to hear when Paul said, she was my first teacher. And these are his two stories. When I arrived at SFAI in September 1962 from Wyoming, I had a Grumbacher painting kit with about 70 small tubes of paint and 3 or 4 fine hair brushes no bigger than 1/4 inch. Also, a new small canvas mounted on cardboard. Joe took one look at it and sent me to Bay City Paints to buy half-gallons of paint and a roll of canvas. I eventually received a BFA and MFA from SFAI in painting, but started working conceptually in 1968. Thank God. At best, I was only a good disciple of the faculty I studied with. And this is what Paul sent. So as you can see, he still has his little wooden box with paints. And I think it's wonderful to see, you know, coming from our expectations as young artists and how we work and how we see how the world may be, and then to be confronted with the reality of it. And here is his second story, which you may know also. Joan also told me that one time she and a few other painters wanted to enter the Richmond Painting Annual, right here, which she did. She was in the painting annuals in 1957, 1959, and 1960, and she received prizes for her work in 1957 and 59.
And she wrote a deal with George Stapleton.
Yes, she did. She wrote about it. She got a $50 prize. It was great. So there's Joan. Okay, she and the other painters wanted to enter the Richmond Painting Annual. She loaded their paintings on the rack attached to a VW bus. On the way to Richmond, the wind came up on the Bay Bridge, and the entire rack of paintings flew off into the San Francisco Bay. They may still be okay, as they were thick Bay City oil paint. An ROV may be able to find them. That's from Paul. So I think it's very clear that she had a great sense of humor and great equanimity in many situations. And how did that influence you? Did that make painting and your artwork less precious? Did it change your perspective on your work?
I think mostly Bocuse was the one who said, stop making all this art, too much art. You know, he would always say, you know, just to get you out of that thing of saving or being precious about things. He was funny. He would come in and do that for us. But when I listen to all these gentlemen and their experiences, I never took painting, and so I think I missed something by taking a painting class with Joan Brown. I never did. I just took those drawing classes, but I guess I got stuck in it because I still draw flat, standing up with oil pastel on paper. Of course, I don't use butcher paper. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I want to draw on brown butcher paper, and it must just be how she is in me. I went to her memorial. They asked me to come, and that was strange because it was, you know, after I had finished my degrees. And I learned more about her then when I heard other people talk about her, how she loved cats and she had her foundations and things. So she was a great person, wonderful person, along with Bishop. And I think when you go to a school like that, you have all of these icons of art teaching you. You know, it kind of blurs sometimes because I remember Bishop, I had him for, I guess for painting, but we used black, and we only had black paint in his class. We had to work from black to no color with just black by watering it down, and it was so, it made you understand about light and shadow and all of that. So that combined with this color explosion that I learned with Joan Brown in those drawing classes, it just keeps me going, even at this time of my life.
You asked about humor, and this isn't in the classroom, but outside the classroom, something that happened. After I got to know her a little bit, I was leaving the building one day and I saw her getting into her car. And you were talking about icons. You know, I always had that feeling about her. This woman's an icon. You know, I was a little cowed by her, but I guess I knew her well enough that it kind of turned around and now I was stalking her. You know, you see someone getting in the car in the parking lot. So I went over to her and she had a little Toyota Fastback, fashionable car, right? And I thought of what to say. I said, Joan, I said, I love the paintings of David Park. She said, I know you're close to David Park. Tell me something about David Park. And she kind of looked at me like, what are you doing by my car? You know, she looked at me and she said, he was sarcastic, very sarcastic. And then she got in her car.
I can't top that, but her sense of humor, I think that it was kind of, I think she purposefully, especially as she became more, you know, spiritually inclined, I think she was inclined toward more positivism, etc. She told me about creative growth. I think she responded to things that were kind of honest, that weren't pompous or pretentious. And not to change the subject into reality, but rereading the book last night, I think that part of her attitude and the kind of upbeat and optimistic attitude was because I think that as a woman, doing the kind of work she did, there was a lot of negative criticism, even from early on. I mean, we all know about Kenneth Baker, the slasher, who trashed her retrospective, but and you know went after her shows while she was still alive. But even the trowel paintings, there were people, you know, criticizing the brown sludge. It was hard to believe that people then, when she was getting so much acclaim, would be criticizing them, but they did. So I think that part of her attitude, her mindset, was this ignoring it and being very upbeat and sort of self-possessed and independent. I think that, and again, I probably shouldn't bring this up, but reading the Hillary Clinton article by David Remnick about strong women, independent women, and the price you pay. And I think Joan may have, her independence, her autonomy, her strength may have, in some ways, you know, been used against her. And maybe that was an armor that she developed, and humor was also maybe part of the armor. But I think she definitely had armor.
It's really astute, really good comment.
Just some random thoughts. Jan mentioned Bay Cities. And Bay Cities produced really cheap paint. I mean, the earth colors were, I think, earth. I think they were dirt and olive oil or something. I don't know. But really cheap and real gritty. Yeah. Also, Joan's husbands. I knew 3 of her 4 husbands. Her first brief marriage was with a young man named Bill Brown, an art student, not William Theophilus Brown, but Bill Brown, who was a student at the Art Institute. Her second marriage was to Manuel Neri, and she and Manuel had a son, Noel, and she did a lot of paintings of Noel. Her third marriage was to Gordon Cook, who I knew pretty well because he was a printmaking teacher at the Art Institute, and a great big guy. He was from Chicago, I think he had driven cabs in Chicago and was kind of a tough guy. And he was very funny. And we'd sit out at the Art Institute, out in the patio there, and he hated Fred Martin, the director of the college, because he wanted the job. And so he's got that weasel would go on about Fred and so on and so forth. But when he and Joan were married, they lived in Antioch, and so they were, you know, kind of isolated, didn't see a lot of her at the time. And then her fourth marriage was to Mike Hebel, who was a lovely man. I went to the wedding, which took place at the old San Francisco Museum on Van Ness and McAllister. And by this time, she was very involved in spiritual things, not any particular denomination, but a little Hinduism, a little Buddhism, a little this, a little that. And also, she had been traveling a lot. In fact, she told me about one trip she made to the Amazon, and she always had these rings and jewelry and so on, and she was in a canoe with some natives paddling down some tributary in the Amazon, and they were eyeing the rings on her fingers. She was getting a little worried about that. Also at the Oakland Museum, oh yes, at the wedding, it was I guess it was a Buddhist wedding because they had this big flowered kind of hopa kind of thing, and half the guests were artists and the other half were policemen, because Mike Hebel was an attorney, but he was also with the police department. He was the head of the police academy. He's a very, very nice man, but you could really tell the artists from the policemen, because they were in their civvies, you know, but these big shouldered guys in their sport jackets and all that. Finally, I have something that I wrote at her memorial, which I can read at the end of all this, which kind of puts all my thoughts together.
I remember the wedding, it was in 1980, and Joan, I think she was barefoot, wearing a sari. I saw pictures and heard about it. And I think she was born in on a litter. She picked the most attractive male art students. I did not make the cut to carry her in. So I wasn't at the wedding. She attended an art student party where you're supposed to come in costume. I think it was Halloween. And she came as an artist. It was very unimaginative. And he came as a cop. But I guess the sad thing is June Felter said it was so sad about Joan because she finally met the man of her life. It seemed like, and they weren't together very long according to the book. They met each other like 6 months before and then quickly married. So it does seem like it was fast, but also very satisfying. They were in the same spiritual path, that's how they met. I think that's...
I was just going to say that I've gotten to know Nancy Boas a little bit, who wrote the biography of David Park. And it took her 20 years to write that biography. And she said that what she did, she chose people in order. She tried to talk to the older people from David Park's life first because she knew the people might be passing on. And she was ready to interview Joan when Joan passed. So Joan was the one person that she really missed, that she really wanted to talk to. And that's just a way of saying that it was far too early. I'd like to hear what Phil has to say, honestly.
Yes, absolutely.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Sure. This was for her memorial. A number of people spoke, and I was included in the group. It was at her memorial, San Francisco Art Institute, November 4th, 1990. 35 years ago, Joan Brown came to the school to study art. It was an intuitive act, a bold and courageous move for a 17-year-old Catholic schoolgirl. She was made to feel welcome by Wally Hedrick and Jay DeFeo. She began studies with Richard Diebenkorn, Frank Lobdell, Manuel Neri, Sonia Gektoff, and Bob Howard. That's Robert Boardman Howard. Within a year, she met and began to study with Elmer Bischoff, who encouraged her in her work and was to become her mentor. Elmer, above all others, recognized Joan's exceptional gifts of intelligence, energy, courage, curiosity, and a feeling for paint and canvas. Joan had a great gift, and she nurtured it with hard work. Inspired by the energized climate of the school and the work of her teachers and fellow students, her work progressed rapidly. Joan soon began to show her work, first in artist-run co-ops like the Six Gallery and the Batman Gallery in the city, and by age 21, in prestigious commercial galleries in New York and Los Angeles. Between 1960 and 65, her work was exhibited and collected internationally, and she was acclaimed in the art press and national media. And yet, in another intuitive and courageous act, she withdrew from that arena and its public acclaim, financial reward, and ego gratification to pursue her art and her life on her own terms. When I met Joan Brown at a party in Oakland in 1961, she was a highly respected, almost legendary personage among my fellow art students. I had the opportunity to know her better in the late 60s at the Art Institute while working with her on a variety of exhibition projects. After having experienced my share of prima donnas, Joan was profoundly refreshing. Here was a person I could talk to, take care of business with in the most straightforward manner. She was devoid of pretense and always respectful of the abilities of others. I suspect that this is one of the qualities that made her such a wonderful teacher. She had the capacity to generate confidence in others, to make us feel that our efforts had substance and value on par with hers. Joan's teaching, her work in attendance, study, and travel, and her life with Mike Hebel seemed to coalesce at some point in this decade. The result in Joan was a high level of creative energy, an essential, graceful state of being which I cannot pretend to describe alone. It is a task that can only be completed by all of us who knew her and know her still. Like all of us here today, I was counting on Joan to be with us for a long time, and to be for younger artists what Bob Howard was for many of us, an authentic link to a golden age, a keeper of the flame. Instead, I'm left with some fleeting impressions. Joan dancing in the Tonga room. Joan in her studio, a wall covered with postcards in the distance. She easily pulls 7 and 8 foot paintings from adjoining slots for me and 2 cats and a large black dog to view. Joan speaking to a graduate seminar group, telling about Charlie Sava, her swimming coach, and his lesson of economy, how to function without needlessly expending energy, and how it applies to a painting and to life. How it applies to painting and life. Joan's choice of words for an egocentric collector, for egocentric collectors and art speculators, one in particular who pleaded for a painting for his collection, only to resell it in a week. Joan and Jay DeFeo planning the rehabilitation of a malnourished dog found at Hunter's Point. The sound of Joan's voice over the telephone. I ask if she'll participate in an impromptu show in a dark South of Market warehouse with a group of Art Institute alums. Sure, she says, and I hear an exclamation point in her voice. Those of us who knew Joan are reluctant to adopt the past tense in her case. We will always know Joan and strive for that state of grace she exemplified in her art and her life.
Thank you. I want to walk into the other gallery and find her there with the work now. You know, it's very, very hard. Yeah, absolutely. You want to pass the mic?
I think Phil sort of references the shows, the early shows, the Sixth Gallery and Spatza and Batman, etc. Joan would say, well, you know, I used to show at the Richmond Art Center, like advice to young students, you know, how to have a career, and we used to show in garages. Well, it was the Sixth Gallery, and I think that Howell was read there. I think maybe Jay DeFeo's show was up. So it was a totally different time. I mean, the art world is in such kind of free fall, I think, and no one knows where it's going, if it'll even survive in any kind of form we recognize. But there was a really small community. It was inexpensive, people could live, it was a very small world, everyone knew everyone else. I think that's what we lose track of. The interconnectedness, the kind of the freedom. You could do what you wanted, failure wasn't such a big deal, you got to be really independent, and Phil probably knows more of this than I do, but I think that's what we forget somehow, is this golden age is when people got to be themselves.
Yeah, I can amplify that out a little bit. I think it's partly a matter of the numbers. I mean, when we were going to school at CCAC and the Art Institute, there were 250 or 300 students. Tuition was $250 a semester. Rent, we never paid more than $75 a month for rent. Today, CCA, they call it now, has over 2,000 students. The Academy of Art, I hear 20,000. And the Art Institute, 500, 600, something like that. And, you know, the scene is just widely dispersed. And at the time, there was the big three, the San Francisco Annual, the Oakland Annual, and the Richmond Annual. And everybody entered. I mean, if you could have your $150 painting next to Richard Diebenkorn's painting, it was really great. And these were juried shows. They were really great, and they really attracted all the artist community. I don't know if it'd be possible to do that today, because you'd get so many entries, and it would just be logistically impossible. But it was a great time, and it was a small community at the time, so it makes a difference.
I'd like to see if there are any questions that some of our people would like to ask here.
Or anybody who knows Joe? Remembers Joe?
Well, maybe you can answer this, Phil, since you brought it up. I was curious about the connection between Jay DeFeo and Joan. Were they fellow students? Was she teacher to Joan, or what was the connection, please?
I'm not sure. I think Jay might have been a little bit older than Joan, a little bit, but they were great friends. They were deeply involved in rehabilitating animals. They would carry old sandwiches in their purse and kibbles and things for dogs and cats, and they would drive around Hunters Point and the Bayview district just looking for stray animals. And that was one of the big connections.
And they were neighbors. They had adjacent apartments where they opened up the wall between them. And
They were the tenants from hell. It was the famous building on the Fillmore. There was a show at the DeRosa of the inhabitants. I think that Simpson lived upstairs, Jay DeFeo lived downstairs. She told us in the seminar that she used to hear Simpson would make the bed squeak. And George Stampley, who seems to have been this sort of dream dealer, the dealer that doesn't exist anymore, came. He was Swiss. He was, not so much about money. He was handling David Park, and he came to San Francisco, asked Part whose work he should see. He said DeFeo. She lived in the building, and in the process of Stampley visiting DeFeo, Jay took him into Joan's space through the hole. And then when they took the rose painting out of the building, they had to cut a hole in the outside window. And just one more point. It was at that point that he, responded to her work, bought some outright, and put her on contract. She got a stipend of, I think, $300 a month. So basically, Jay made Joan's career. And it didn't quite work the way when Jay DeFeo wanted tenure, wanted a job at Cal, and Joan was in a power position. But hey, it's the art world, right?
And I was just going to add to your fall reading list, The Rat Bastard Protective Association by Anastasia Alcman is a wonderful document of that early era.
She did a whole series of works on the Rat Bastard, didn't she?
She did, and it's a wonderful way to go. Look back further than certainly I knew before, to go deep into Joan's life.
Also, I want to just say that we're very fortunate in Berkeley that the Bancroft Library received the papers of the J. of Joan Brown estate. So there are letters and cards there between that she received from Jay. So you can the correspondence that you have is not what Joan sent out, unless they're papers of her own writing, but in terms of correspondence. But there is correspondence that's come in from Jay, and there is some writing that Joan had also, so you can see both. And their friendship was sustained throughout Jay's battle with cancer. She was ill, and the irony, it's a terrible thing to even say irony, but Jay was the one who was ill, and then Joan was the one who died first. And but all of that is there in the Bancroft Library. We have all of that, which is a wonderful resource and very moving. Any other questions?
Anybody know Joan that has anything to say?
She taught at Mills when I was an undergraduate, and I guess it was 1973, maybe 74. I don't remember exactly the year. And I had an independent study with her. And the only time I saw her, she came in. I had a big painting of a buffalo, and it was on raw canvas. And she said, "It needs more paint." That was it.
It needs more paint. Anyone else? Did you want to add to that? No? No? Well, then I will say thank you very much to our wonderful guests, our panelists, to you, the audience, for this really very moving discussion of Joan Brown. We are going to have another program with some of the artists in this exhibition in Earth, Wind, and Fire, who share a lot in common with Joan in terms of a very deep connection to nature, the environment, to the very personal way of living your life. And we will also have a session with Don Farnsworth, who at Magnolia Editions printed the wonderful print that we have in the exhibition, Golden Gate. And he's going to come and talk about actually working with Joan. And it was a very involved process. It looks to the surface like a very simple and free print, but in fact there was reduction, woodblock and lithography, and then hand gold leaf that she applied to those prints. It was a very involved process, and we look forward to having Don here also talking about working with her.
And she was sort of critical of prints. She had that kind of abstract expression. That period, she thought that prints were less energy than paintings or sculpture, less direct. So it'd be interesting hearing him in terms of
This
swimming against
was
the
a
tide
lot of
something.
energy and a lot of effort.
Lovely print, yeah. But as a
And quite
printmaker
wonderful.
myself, I felt a bit defensive. She, whatever, she had her prejudices, that's for sure. Her
Well,
biases.
And that's what makes it so interesting and intriguing. And again, some of the things that you can discover when you look at her archives and the papers in the Bancroft are the way in which those very simple images actually are so worked out and calculated. She worked with not only drawings, but with tracing paper, with really moving things a little bit here, changing the posture. You know, the monkey's tail changes direction from right to left, and the cow's looking up or down. And she was drawing and working things out all the time, you know, the fronds of a plant. And a lot of people don't use checks anymore or have their checkbooks in their bags. But if there wasn't paper available, she did drawings on the little slips in the back of your checkbook where you write your deposit, little deposit slips. There are those in the Bancroft Library, little drawings. I mean, she drew on absolutely everything, and she could draw. Yeah.
You know, when Joan and Manuel were married, they didn't have a lot of money, and at some point they were making sculptures of birds and figures out of scrap materials that they'd find on the street, you know, sticks and little pieces of 2x4 and wire and so on, string. And they were selling them for like $1.50. I mean, Fred Martin was selling paintings for 50 cents in the dollar, little paintings in cafes. And I recently saw a couple of those birds at Hackett Mill in San Francisco, and now they're $75,000.
And also the Nancy Boas book, David Partridge, I love that book. He is a saint. But this book, it's probably as close to a biography as we're going to get of Joan Brown for a while. Karen Tsuchimoto and Jacqueline Bass did the show at the University Art Museum and the Oakland Museum, and there's a whole hell of a lot of their history, Joan's like childhood and her life with Cook. And
Illustrated chronology, which is really useful.
yeah, it's a really important book. I found it at 8 books for as little as $20. You can get it at Moe's. You don't have to go through Amazon. And University Art Museum still has catalogs from her show in '74 when she got tenure at Berkeley. I think you can get this for like $10, but it has some great pictures.
And if you love Earth and you don't want to purchase more paper, you can read that catalog online. It's all scanned and online. But if you want to add to your collection, because you all love holding things, we have for your own hands and enjoyment a catalog of the current exhibition, and it is available at the reception desk. It's got all the work in there, and we hope you'll enjoy it. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. It is $25 including tax, so that's like $23.50. About. No. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.